Thank you so much, Runako, for sharing from the work that you're doing with your organization and really viewing this from a perspective we don't always get in academia. And just we're very glad that you're here to be part of the conversation. So we do have now about 10 minutes for the panelists. If you would like to communicate with one another, either in the form of questions or comments. I know that some of you have already spoken to each other. If we keep this brief, I think then we can go on to some of the questions from the audience.
I do have a very short comment that Professor Yan Hairong's very nuanced sort of like presentation on the different stages and this like periods of the existence or non-existence discontinuity in terms of racial thinking in Chinese history take place. And I think one of my questions would be to what extent we understand these different stages as ruptures instead of how, for example, an earlier episode may have an influence on a later or on how we interpret a later episode, or to what extent should we emphasize on the differences, and to what extent should we point out continuities that happen across these episodes. And I also, this is something that I learned from Professor Don Wyatt from Middlebury, who is a premodernist and who has done work on the Blacks in premodern China. And I think he makes a quite convincing point to me, at least, is that a lot of this like racial thinking, and I think Hairong mentioned that a lot of it happened toward late 19th century when the world revolted itself, especially for the late Qing intellectuals in encountering imperialism and like Western threat. And but what Professor Wyatt made me think about is also how, for example, so how do we account for the existence of, for example, darker skinned slaves that appeared in coastal areas of China in pre-modern periods, and how China has been implicated, for example, in Indian Ocean slave trade through Arab merchants, and how do we interpret those episodes? I think, of course, we can say, oh, it's not something that is institutionalized, it's not systemic. It may be very episodic, very anecdotal, but then how do we interpret the racial thinking that is happening among the Chinese writing like much earlier? And can racial thinking exist without the encounter with the West? And that's something that I've been thinking about. And I do have a lot that I want to talk about with Runako Celina, but I think I will just stop here and to leave more space for others.
Thank you, Kun, for your thoughts. I also was thinking about the history of slavery preceding the history of enlightenment that Yan Hairong spoke about. So I'm really glad you brought up that topic. Hairong, I think you also had a comment.
Yeah, so do you want me to respond? Or...
Yes, why don't you could respond to Kun and then share your question.
We probably can speak about two different kinds of approaches to racial thinking. One, if I may, I might call it continuous, the kind of approach that emphasizes continuity. And to some extent, I think it has a risk of ending up essentializing racial thinking, to say that we can never escape from it. That's always been there, right? So that's not the approach I take. I take a different kind of approach, which is to see it as situational emergence. that it does come and go. And as to pre-modern China, in terms of the presence of Black people in pre-modern China, and I think to some extent there is at the time was through slave trade. I don't know to what extent that really was in making an impact of help them wording the words differently in a sense. To some, I think perhaps it's still kind of marginal, and whether it has actually developed the kinds of racial thinking, the kind of racializing ideology that we see much later on, is a question for debate. Of course, in terms of racial study of race, there are different kinds of approaches to this, if I understand it right. One is to see it as very much connected with capitalist economy itself. What the other is to see it as more of an essential, continuous, almost, it's more emphasizing this kind of essential presence, I guess. So yes, I've made a decision to take a different approach, and I think in China, in the modern history of China, which for me is more of a evidence that I'm familiar with, to talk about Mao era China, racial thinking had largely disappeared. Because the world, Chinese people at the time, they were looking at the world in a very different way. I'm not sure, does that address your question?
Yes, very much. So, although I have further questions, but I think I want to just leave more space for other people to chime in.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Hairong, did you have a comment and a question?
And yeah, I do have a question for both for Kun and also for Runako. That is, I very much appreciate how you bring social movements and into the combat in fight against racism. However, state is missing, it seems to me. So in my proposal, I wanted to bring the state back in, and I wanted to know what you think of that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Runako, would you like to respond first and then Kun?
Sorry, it cut out a little bit. It might have been me. Did you say the state?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I think, from a community perspective, I think what I would say is that there have been attempts to engage either the powers that be or people who have access to them. I can speak about that from a community academia perspective, as in the African Student Associations and relaying messages to, so there's a group of African ambassadors that meet periodically in Beijing, and they obviously have connections. And so every time incidents of mass incidents such as Guangzhou take place, I remember being on a committee, if you like, to gather community perspectives and bring them to the African ambassadors with the thought in mind that they would then relay them to those in power. So that's what I mean when I say that's the state, I'm saying those in power. And the idea was that would lead to change, possibly accountability, possibly apologies, in reference particularly to the incidents in Guangzhou. Obviously that didn't come about. Change did, in a sense, because some of what we were seeing did stop. But obviously we didn't get the kind of accountability or apology that we wanted or expected. In terms of looking at the longer term, there have been attempts again to advocate for the establishment of an anti-racist curriculum. But I wouldn't say that it's reached any kind of engagement at the state level, if that makes sense. I'd say that this has happened primarily with those who work at private schools, for example. Sometimes those not even owned by Chinese. So sometimes I know of someone, for example, who's actually, I think she's Black American, and she is trying to do that in her own little pocket in Guangzhou where she works. But attempts, I think, and I feel this personally, to engage at a higher level, I think fall on deaf ears. And I think this is really where solidarity comes into it, because my presumption is that there are layers of difficulty that we are finding as a community. Number one, this isn't home. And, it could be communication issues. It could be a number of different things that impact our ability to kind of get that structural change, if that makes sense. Whereas there may be individuals, and I would include my own professors in that, and I have made this case to them, who will have abilities of their own, if that makes sense, to reach those in power. And I don't know if it's because they haven't made these attempts. I have asked, believe you me, I've asked, or if it's just because these attempts have fallen on deaf ears, as our own have, that very little change has happened in that sense. But yeah, there have been attempts to engage at a higher level. I hope that actually hits the mark of what you're asking. If it doesn't, please let me know.
Thank you,
Yes.
Runako. Does that work for you, Hairong?
Yes.
Kun, would you like to respond to the question from Yan Hairong?
Yeah, sure. So I don't personally have like very close experience, like how is it like working like with the state or otherwise. So, but I've been having like secondhand sort of information passed on from other people, and I think one thing that thank you for pointing out the elephant in the room, the state. I think a lot of especially in the West, like people tend to understand grassroots activism as like totally in opposition to the state, and also especially in the case of China, as if there's like, here are people who are conscious and critical of the Chinese government, and then they are not they're consciously acting against the state, and then the state is sort of like also always constantly repressing what is on the ground. Well, I think in reality it's more complicated, and I think in the case of Sanyoni Solidarity, there was a lot of collaboration, and this collaboration need to happen for things to work. And in the case of state-sponsored institutions, universities, I think they also have a lot of resource and power to do good work. But I think also what I've been noticing, and also from the experience of other academics, writers, is also there's this constant censorship and self-censorship, of course, happening at different levels, like not only for those who speak out as writers, but at different platforms being censored or self-censoring. And then it, although there's like this logic of like some discussions may be too risky, or like may not be nuanced enough, but at the same time, I think self-censorship or censorship does prevent us from having more nuanced, elaborate, and sustainable discussion about issues of race and racism. And I would say like state is not like always in opposition to what we're doing, and sometimes sometimes we are chasing the same goals, but other times I feel like there's this very complex tensions that is standing in the way, and that especially people in China have to learn how to maneuver and how to work with it. And I don't have a very clear answer, but thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I think it's very important to note as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kun. And so, Runako, thank you for responding to the question that was posed to you. Would you like to pose a question or make a comment to the other presenters?
I think a comment, I guess, to Kun Huang and also Hairong. I was interested really in some of your research and some of your work on the experiences of Chinese in Zambia and the kind of police profiling that you mentioned. I'd love to hear more about that and the origins of that and the reasons for it. It's kind of to do with my own musings about understanding racism and how it plays out in different contexts. Yes, I'd love to hear more about that. And Kun Huang, I was interested because you mentioned the efforts in San Wenli. And I thought one thing that I forgot to mention, actually, my thoughts are a bit scrambled, so apologies for that. But I think it kind of comes back to this question of proximity, and we often feel like we're doing more work when we are up close to a community, right? Even though there's lots of work that we can do remotely or within our own communities, whatever we define those as. And I thought this was interesting because what I kind of noticed during the Guangzhou period, I don't remember what to call it, but the Guangzhou incident, some people term it, was that, so immediately as things happened, for context, so Sarun, who is our co-manager, she lived in Guangzhou at the time. She studied in Guangzhou. She was the first female president of the African Student Association at SCUT in Guangzhou. And you know, this was happening to her as things, as you know, she was experiencing a lot of the things, not some, but you know, the alarms that were fitted in lots of Africans' apartments, etc., etc. She experienced this. And what I thought was interesting was that immediately as things were playing out, we got put into WeChat groups created by, so there were two different groups originally, if I'm not mistaken. There was two African-American women who created groups to support the community. And there was also a Nigerian-led, movement to assist those on the ground. Obviously, because the majority, not all, but the majority of people impacted were Nigerian. As this happened, you know, obviously people were rushing around doing left, right, and center. And I thought it was interesting, again, because of the digital space and the lack of representation sometimes of African voices, and also because they didn't choose to publicize what they were doing. But there wasn't really, and you did mention it, but elsewhere I've seen it not mentioned, that the initial responses came from those within the community. And the reason why I think that is important to note is because it can otherwise feed into this narrative of, because we know that in terms of some of the anti-African narratives that exist in Chinese context rely on this idea of Africans as always needing help and assistance. You know, if you go on to Weibo, or even if you go on Douyin, sometimes you'll see this constant narrative of, oh, you know, and I've seen it, I've been doing some research into social media stars, like social media influencers of relatively large platforms, Chinese in Africa. And what you constantly see is, oh, why are you helping? You know, if someone, there's these videos that are giving Africans food or giving, it's quite problematic, obviously. But some of the comments are like, you know, there are people here who need that. You know, why are we helping them all the time? And then there are the scholarship elements and those kind of things. And sorry, I think I'm going off topic, but the reason why I mention that is because, number one, I think it's important in terms of agency to see that, and to be aware of the fact that these initiatives, you know, happened within the community. And then secondly, because of the danger of adding to that consistent narrative. And I think that was one thing I was going to ask in relation to that. Yeah, so I think that's more of a long comment, but it's just something that I thought was of relevance to mention there, because on social media, they didn't obviously take to social media. And since then, I know the women involved, and they didn't want to, you know, they didn't do it for, I'm not saying anyone did it for social media, but they didn't want it to be made aware, like what they were doing. Yeah, I just thought that was important to mention there. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for emphasizing that. I think it's very important that we do not treat it as like this is like a very we do not repeat the savior narrative of like, oh, this is like the Chinese helping the Africans. And I think this also can be tied into what we were talking about censorship and self-censorship, and also how these efforts have been happening in different pockets, and we are at the different I guess like different points or different train of the information channel, and then we're not like, I think especially in that period, like nobody is seeing the whole picture, and we have this like separate groups, and we talk to different people, and then information get relayed and get passed on, and so I think it's a very complex scenario at that time. It doesn't, well, yeah. Okay, I don't have a very good way to unpack this yet, but I think yeah, and also this point about feeling like we're doing more work when we are close, I think is important, because this do make you reflect on why this episode seem important to me. And I think it's not only the episode in itself, but also what it the later conversations that happened within Chinese and Chinese diaspora communities happen on the media and among different groups that this incident sort of sparked. And so I think for many, especially in the Chinese diaspora who haven't been working on race or haven't been focusing on Africans and the Black populations in China, this was like one of their point of like realization that these things do matter. And I think it was at the same time that many were experiencing anti-Asian sentiments abroad related to coronavirus. So all these things like add up and make this kind of like anti-racist fight more urgent, even for people who are not like working in this area. So so yeah, I think that's why it was an important episode, at least for me, thinking about how we are even having this conversation, ongoing conversations, and how different people are thinking about how do we move forward and how do we do more. And yeah.
Thank you for your response, Kun. This has been great to have this exchange among the panelists, and now we'll turn to the audience. There are a lot of really great comments, recommendations for reading, and of course, good questions in the chat. What I'd like to do is encourage everyone, first of all, to look at the chat, because there are some great insights and resources there. I'd like to start with two questions that I think the whole panel could really speak to, and then ask the panelists to please review the chat, look at the questions that are addressed directly to you, and pick a question that you would like to answer. But let me start by putting forward these two, I think, important, relatively general questions. The first one is from Antonia Bamidele. Welcome, Antonia. Great to see you here. She posed this question to Runako, but I think it's one that everyone could talk about. And her question is, what is the difference in using the term African or Black within the Chinese racism context? Are they treated the same way or differently? She's now living in the Middle East, where she says there's a difference. For instance, a Black American or a Black British person is treated as a superior person and given better packages than someone who has a Black African origin, even if they have the same qualifications and experiences. And how can we understand these different experiences of racism? That's from Antonia. And then another one I thought we could address that collectively by Cheryl Schmitz. And welcome to Cheryl also. Let me just come back to that question. And Cheryl asks about whiteness, and this is, of course, as you know, something I'm interested in. And Cheryl asks about anti-racist efforts in the United States tend to involve the intense scrutiny of white privilege, and call for reflection about this on the part of people who can be read or as white. Is there an equivalent or comparable practice that is part of efforts to highlight and struggle against anti-Black racism in Chinese contexts? How does the people of color versus white people hierarchy of privilege and oppression, which is often presumed in US anti-racist discourse, and we might add European, get translated into anti-racism efforts led by Chinese activists. So 2 questions, one about, is African and Blackness the same or different? And then the second one about whiteness and the idea of white privilege. And just any of the panelists, please feel welcome to address those, and then do review the others. We'll be continuing until 11. So if we could keep the responses fairly short, we can include more of the audience participation at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, the first question I thought was really, really important, and I think it touches on privileges and how, as a wider community, there are differences in experiences. I think the first thing that I will mention is that nationality does play a part. Nationality plays a part, as does complexion and color, actually. And this is through conversations, again, internal conversations. So I've noticed these kind of layers that change how you're treated. So the same concept that you mentioned in the Middle East exists in China. You are more likely to, you'll still face discrimination, you'll still face anti-Blackness, etc., but you are more likely to be accepted for a job if you hold a Western country's nationality, essentially, doesn't matter which one, than you are if you are African. And there have been so many internal conversations about what this means, and how we kind of show solidarity to each other within our community. I think one thing that I wanted to start and preface this with, actually, which I missed, is that, you know, the experience is and this is something I'm still unpacking, I'm still kind of trying to understand for myself, is really, really interesting, I think, because again, people's experiences and people's backgrounds are very different. So if you take someone like our co-manager, I always use her as an example because we have these conversations for the past 3 years, but who, you know, have left home for the first time, and for the first time interacting with so many different versions of Africanness, and therefore are forced to kind of reassess your own individual identity as an African or someone of African descent. And also to redefine your ideas of what community means. You know, when you live in a place whereby you do feel more isolated, perhaps, and where there are less examples of, specifically speaking, outside of the more recognized pockets of African diasporas in China, so outside of the Guangzhous, for example, when you are in a place where there are less people who share your exact nationality, so if you are Nigerian, there are less Nigerians, there might be other African nationals or people of African descent, your idea of community and identity immediately, and many people have described this process, becomes more Pan-African. And, you know, that's why one thing that I'm quite interested in and that we are looking into more closely is there's been a lot of work done on interracial relationships, but less so intraracial ones, and the ties that form between members of the African diaspora in China, who again are sometimes meeting each other for the first time. And that's something that I think as a platform we really represent, because we have a team of 8 at the moment. We all come from different places. I think the 6 regions, and it is 6 because of the diaspora is considered a region of the continent by the African Union. So the 6 regions of the diaspora are represented in our team, and that's not by design. This is literally just people who flocked together and came because they recognized a community with differences. But again, just despite the fact that we do tend to see each other as one community, there are those instances of privileges that are doled out dependent on your complexion and on your skin tone. And I remember, your complexion and on your nationality. And I remember actually during the Guangzhou incidents, we started to have these very honest conversations, because rigorously examining your own privilege is difficult, and we all know this, and that's why it's so triggering to have your community or a community that you identify with determined as racist or determined as anything else, right? It's very uncomfortable to do, but we had this very honest conversation about it. You know, those who are of lighter complexion, how do you use that privilege that you get to and leverage it to benefit the wider community. Equally, you know, one of the nationalities that I hold is from the UK. How do I use that privilege? I know that that means that I will get a job perhaps that someone else won't. When I open that door or get a foot in that door, who else can pass through after me is the question that we are now starting to ask within ourselves as a community. And I think this is really important to note, because instead of just denying, you know, like I think one of the problems that many within the community felt about their approach to Guangzhou was the denial, the constant denial. And so when we reflect on the privileges that we have again amongst each other, instead of denying them, we're confronting them head on and saying, yes, they exist. Now what, you know, what next? So yeah, I hope that kind of gets down to it. Just to say quickly, I do identify that as proximity to whiteness. Proximity to whiteness grants you a level of privilege in a Chinese context, and that's whether it is, again, because it's not just nationality, it's not just, oh, if you have this passport, it's also complexion, and I've seen that happen also too. So yeah, I tend to term it as proximity to whiteness. There are other layers to it too. I've even heard things related to hair texture and phenomena that we wouldn't even realize exist in a Chinese context. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say there. I think the second question, the only thing I wanted to say, I can't remember who, I think Kun Huang, it was your paper that mentioned the idea of Hairong versus Waigoran, right? So like a foreigner in general. Oh, I've read this somewhere anyway, so perhaps it wasn't your paper, sorry. But the idea of the general foreigner being white, and, you know, then when we tend to refer to Africans or Black people, we tend to use the term Hairong instead. And I think there is definitely a privilege that is attached to whiteness in a Chinese context. And one of those privileges is to be seen as the standard foreigner, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was what I wanted to say.
Yes, thank you very much, Runako. Hairong, would you like to respond to those two questions? I think you're muted still, Hairong.
Sorry. Yes, I think Runako already addressed the first question very well. I'm going to focus on the second question, which is on whiteness and white privilege. This goes to the question, I think, related to what some scholars have already talked about, that is, there's no single history of racialization, so that we cannot expect really that the kind of racial experience that exists in some other places. Not to say that racialization do not exist in those places, but the history and experiences are different. And I highly recommend Charles W. Mills' book called The Racial Contract, which is actually to look at the U.S. history and how racialization is so deeply embedded in the structure of U.S. capitalism itself. Without looking at that, so to understand white privilege in the U.S., for example, one has to understand that political economic context and how race played such an important part of the core of the U.S. Capitalist ideology itself. But when you look at China, then Chinese experience of development in the 20th century has been very, very different. So by and large, I think China itself has racialization emerged in China in the reform, largely in the reform period. And even so, especially in 1990s, it's very, very clear that the West is looked upon as the model to be emulated, right? The Chinese are putting themselves somewhere below that. And so there's a lot of sort of hierarchies, and some of the elite Chinese are doing that kind of racialization. So the white privilege doesn't exist in China. It's experienced in a very different way. In some other places, I talk about Chinese economy as peripheral. It's not part of the global core economies. And I think in terms of racial thinking for some Chinese, that's also mirrored in the kinds of economic status that the characteristics of Chinese economy itself as well. So again, I think that kind of white privileges. The other point I want to make about reflection, individual reflections on white privileges is very important. But since I'm coming from much more political economic context, I think the much more effective way perhaps to really combat and fight against these kind of racial privilege is to actually also has to be combined with anti-capitalist struggles. In my view, the two. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hairong, for your response. And lastly, Kun, would you like to respond to those two questions?
Yes, I think I do have something to add to, especially the second set of questions asked by Cheryl. And I agree very much with Professor Yan Hairong's point that it's not only about race, and it's also about class and a lot of other social contradictions within the Chinese society that have been remained like unexamined and unchallenged. And it's also about like ethnicity, Han, like being Han, and gender, sexuality, and then the urban and rural divide, and also education, and a lot of those things. I think now there's like a collective lack of discussion about these issues, and I do want to link this to how and actually what I've been seeing among the Chinese diaspora, those who are more aware of racism and who are more proactive to challenge it, and a lot of us or them overlap with the Chinese feminists. So there's like the overlapping of Chinese feminist network with the anti-racist struggles. And I do think if we look at the Me Too movement that have been happening in China, there's start to challenge this sort of like privilege and power that is inherent in relations of, for example, in professional settings, in academic settings, and how those campaigns sometimes have been criticized as by some people as like, oh, it reminds us of what happened in the Cultural Revolution when the Red Guards trying to just like drag down like all the figures of power. And I think like there's this rhetoric about how the Cultural Revolution episode is being traumatic for Chinese. I think like surfaced many times when we talk about to challenge power, to challenge people's privilege, and also to reflect on our own privilege. And I think it's not only in terms of race relations, but I think it's a more general problem that I guess continue to trouble like contemporary Chinese society and how we understand social relations and social contradictions.
Thank you very much, Kun. We have just about 10 minutes left, and so if the speakers could please look through the questions in the chat. I think we can go back and have each of you, if you could very briefly, in just 1 or 2 minutes, respond to a question. We'll start with Runako, and then Hairong, and then Kun, and then we'll wrap up by 11 a.m. here Eastern time. I know it's getting late in the evening for those of you in East Asia. So Runako, is there a question in the chat that you would like to speak to?
Sorry, yeah, I'm just scrolling back through.
If you'd like, we could wait and let Hairong respond and then come back to
anyone
take a minute. Sure. Hairong, is there a question that you'd like to speak to?
Yes, but I probably need time also to think.
Oh my goodness. Okay. What about you, Kun? If not, I'd be happy to pick something.
Feel free to pick something. I'm also just reading.
Okay. I do have one question. I think several people have addressed Hairong. Perhaps you could think about this one. Di Wu is one, and then I think Edwin about the Mao era. And you mentioned that the reconstruction of race in the Mao era caused race to disappear, and people are asking, wasn't there Afro-Asian solidarity? Wasn't there an idea of the third world that was generated through racial ideologies that were generated at this time? Perhaps you could, I think that's important to many of the listeners, in that you made a pretty strong statement there that race disappeared because it was displaced by class. Could you please, that would be one suggestion.
Okay, yeah, that's a great suggestion. It also gives me a chance to clarify what I meant. I think I define racial thinking is accepting race as a natural category and to map the world in a racial hierarchical way. That's what I mean by racial thinking. And in the Mao period, obviously people are aware that race as a discourse, as a political structure, as ideology, they exist in the world, and they see race. They saw race as a problem to combat. As also it's embodied in colonial refuted the kinds of racial thinking that has been around in the world. And in fact, they had, through supporting anti-colonial struggles, they wanted to refute that kind of racial thinking, racial domination in the world. I hope that makes it clear what I meant by racial thinking had disappeared in China.
Excellent. I think that directly addressed the question. Thank you very much. Runako, did you have a question now that you would like to answer?
Yeah, I think I saw Suvi's question. I think I touched on it earlier, but I'll give really quickly to that. And then also Liang Chen, if I could kind of try and combine the two. So Liang Chen's question was about the different experience between students and businessmen. I think there are many differences that I've seen and heard from speaking to people, and obviously from the student experience being part of being based at Beida for 3 years and Tsinghua for a year. Not every campus experience is going to be the same, but I can give insights based on that. So I think the first thing to note is that many, not all, but many African students will speak Chinese. And actually, I found that African students are amongst some of the most skilled when it comes to actually engaging in their studies in the language, you know. And I think that language makes a huge difference, because especially for me, I remember when I first came to China, not knowing what was being said made a difference in terms of interpretation about whether, you know, whether someone is being nice, whether someone's being horrible, what the intention is behind, you know, certain behaviors and actions and stuff like that. And obviously it gives you a cultural insight that you won't have elsewhere. So, you know, there are business people and entrepreneurs who have a continued relationship with China and come and go and come and go, and thus will develop a level of fluency in the language. But there are also those who don't ever get that degree of proximity. So I think that is one core difference. Also, they're likely to be based in different places, right? I think so much of the scholarship that exists in academic spaces, so much of the understanding about Africans in China existing in Guangzhou, and obviously we know that there are differences between different cities and otherwise as well. But Guangzhou is a very special place, as is Yiwu as well. And so I think because most people who are engaged, many people who engage in entrepreneurship and who come to China for business purposes will be based there. Their experiences will automatically differ from those who are based elsewhere also. So just to mention on that one, I think, Suvi, the question about representing a community and, you know, homogenous voice, I think the difficulty is that, I think the first thing to say is that a homogenous voice is not necessarily what it is. And I think it's about getting as many different perspectives as possible. And so it might actually take us longer than it would a typical platform to get a piece of content out, because we want to give due time almost to the different perspectives that exist within the community. And that won't be possible across the board all the time. But what we try and do as much as possible is to allow for counter ideas and different kind of concepts, whether it exists in one piece or whether it exists in multiple. So I think that's one way of countering those kind of challenges and making sure that we are as representative as we can possibly be. So as I said, you know, when we started, there was no desire to create a platform, an organization or anything. It was out of need actually, and we were spurred on by the people within the community who were like, hey, like, you know, again, I think I mentioned, and I'll say this really quickly, but it was in 2018 when it was our final year at Beida, at PKU, and when the Spring Festival incident happened, I could already see online, you know, the Western journalists had their perspective and they were going at it. And then the Chinese journalists or commentators also had their own perspectives. But really there was a lack of representation from community perspectives. And again, they were varied, and we tried to stress that. And once that came out, and this has happened again, it's happened with Guangzhou as well, just there was such a desire within the community to have at least, and it doesn't have to be one platform, it should be multiple voices. And that's why since there have been the creation of organizations such as the Black China Caucus, as I mentioned, Black Voices on Greater China by Corey Cooper, there's numerous different platforms that exist now. Africans on China is another one, to fill these gaps. I call them gaps, not a single gap. So I think the more voices there are, the better, and the diversity of these voices. Again, we are based in several different cities. About the majority of us are still in China. I hope to be back, and we represent different nationalities as well. Like I said, all 6 regions at current. So yeah, I think those are the only 2 questions. I hope that's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Runako. Very interesting perspective. Kun, we just have about 2 minutes. If you have something that you would like to say as our last speaker here today, just if you could respond in 2 minutes to one of the questions, please.
Okay, so I think I will also add something to the discussion of the Maoist period. And I think the more general comment I will make is there's still like too little scholarship on like racialization and race making in, I think, the long history of China. And in the Maoist period, I think although there's this like challenge of the colonialist or like a very Western notion of race or blackness that happened, that the Chinese intellectuals have been engaging in the earlier period. But one of my questions is also to what extent there's like the remaking or like re-narrating of some of what is Africa and what is the Black struggle. Although I think a lot of text performances take a very positive route, but to what extent those images are also mediated by the socialist or Maoist discourse and aesthetic at that time. And I remember on yesterday's panel between Roberto, Professor Lan Shanshan and Professor Adams Bodomo, Professor Lan Shanshan talked about how even in that period, China would take on the role of like the leader, the revolutionary leader of the world, and constructing this Afro-Asian like brotherhood or fraternity, and to what extent that narrative had backlash after the revolutionary period. And I think these are some of the things that we should consider. And also I saw in the comments someone brought up the Ghanaian students what's his name? I think Emmanuel John Hebby, and his experience in China, and also some of the on-the-ground experience by Africans visitors during the Maoist period, and how they encounter, like they still have a lot of like racialized encounters on the ground, and how do we really like attend to all that complexities and all those contradictions that's happening at different levels and between different discourses, representations, just within the Maoist period, but also in other periods as well. So I guess my final comment is like, there's still a lot of research to be done for this to really like, I guess like to make sense or to reveal itself. And I don't think like we have like a final say on like really what's the racial history of China at this point.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kun, for those words. And as a historian, I definitely affirm the need for more historical research for all periods. And it's been wonderful to have everyone here. It's really unique to have a panel of people in different disciplines across generations, from academia and from community and grassroots backgrounds, to give us a perspective on a complex topic. If the chat is any indicator, this conversation needs to continue. So perhaps the CAAC can think about ways to continue this community engagement around an issue that is obviously historical and also contemporary and also about the future. So again, I'd like to thank everyone very, very much for participating. A big shout out again to Roberto Castillo, our fearless organizer, to Lingnan University for hosting us, and to the whole Chinese in Africa, Africans in China network for mobilizing us, even despite the pandemic, to continue our tradition of having biannual conferences and symposia. So thank you all once again, and I hope to see you at the next event. Take care.